Hello Dungeon Jedi Masters, Todd Moonbounce here with our second video in the Star Wars 5E Basics series. Our first video we went over choosing your ability scores, a few methods on how to do that, and today we're going to talk about those specific abilities and skills that go along with that, and at the end talk a little bit about how those ability scores generate an ability modifier and how that comes into play in a few other aspects building your character. So abilities and skills are basically the description of a creature's physical and mental characteristics. It's basically lays the foundation of who your character is and what they can do. So as I mentioned before, there are 6 abilities that every character, creature, NPC basically goes off of. So we have strength, which is going to be a measure of physical power. Dexterity is going to measure agility. Constitution, which will measure endurance. Intelligence, measuring reasoning and memory. Wisdom, measuring awareness and intuition. And lastly, charisma, which is a measure of force and personality. So these are our 6 core abilities. As I said, basically the foundation of everything that your character can do, and these abilities will influence a lot of other aspects of your character, which we'll touch on as we go through them individually. So before we get into the individual abilities, I want to touch on ability rolls briefly. So there are 3 types of ability rolls. You have an ability check, you have a saving throw, and you have an attack roll. So these are your 3 main ability rolls you will use in the game. The ability check is any type of, I like to use the concept of an active, a proactive or an active type of action or check. So if you are trying to jump over along a gap in the floor or whatever, you're actively trying to do something, so you're going to do an ability check there, or you're actively trying to persuade somebody, that's ability check. So inversely to that is saving throw, and that is going to be a reactive roll. So if someone throws a grenade at you and there's an explosion and you need to try and dive out of the way, that's a reaction. You're reacting to that, so you need to make a save and see how well you can get away from that. Or if you've been injected with poison or something, you need to see a Constitution save to see how well your body can fight that off. Lastly is the attack roll. We're not going to touch on the attack roll too much in this video, but it is the 3rd type of roll there, so I want to mention that. That is, as it says, related to attacks with your weapons. So those do use abilities, which we will touch on briefly, but the main focus is obviously the ability checks and saving throws here. So let's get into those abilities one by one and discuss the skills that are part of each ability and some of the other features of a character that go along with each. So first up, we'll look at strength. As I said, strength is all about measuring a character's physical power. So strength on its own, you're going to be looking at anything that would be using that bodily power, such as lifting, pushing, pulling, breaking into something. That's where you're going to use strength. The skill, for the saving throw for strength, there's not really many uses for a strength saving throw. I do not believe there's any powers that use a strength saving throw, but one example that you could come up with is a blast of wind, and you need to try and stand your ground and resist against that strong burst of wind. So if someone, if there was a power that pushed a blast of wind at you, or there was a gust from a storm, you could use a strength save to see how well you can hold your ground and resist that. These skills for strength, just athletics. Athletics is the only skill for strength. Athletics is going to be looking at climbing, jumping, swimming, activities such as that, will fall into the athletics category when you want to be a little more specific than just a general strength there. And beyond the abilities and skills, strength comes into play with melee attacks and damage. So when you do your melee attack roll, you would add your strength modifier. And when you calculate damage, you would also add your strength modifier. And that's something we'll touch on in a attack video down the road, but just to touch on it now, generally melee attacks and damage, you're going to add your strength. Lastly, strength applies to a character's ability with lifting and carrying. So not in the sense of a skill or an action. This is kind of what your character can do, how much they can lift and how much they can carry. There is a formula to figure out based on your strength score and strength modifier, and you can say this is how much you're able to lift, this is how much you're able to carry. So depending on those numbers, if you're getting a lot of equipment, or maybe you're trying to carry another person or an object, there is rules in there and formulas in there based on your scores and modifier to calculate that. So next up is Dexterity. Dexterity, as I mentioned, is all about your agility, how fast you can move. It does get into skills with abilities with your hands, being swift with that. So the saving throw for Dexterity, this does get used quite a bit, and this is going to be, I think I gave the example earlier, if someone throws a grenade at you and you want to dive out of the way, you're going to use a Dexterity saving throw to see how well you can avoid that, get out of the way, things like that. So that's going to be your most common use of a Dexterity save. For the skills with Dexterity, we have 3 here. Acrobatics, sleight of hand, and stealth. So acrobatics is going to be any type of check that is looking for you to stay on your feet. Maybe you're trying to cross a sheet of ice, balancing on a tightrope, things of that nature. That's going to be acrobatics. Sleight of hand, as I mentioned, there's some use here of how well you can use your hands with Dexterity, and that would be sleight of hand for sure. So if you're trying to pickpocket someone or maybe place something on another person, sometimes I've seen DMs use sleight of hand for how well someone ties a rope if they're securing somebody, an enemy or whatnot. So that's a use of sleight of hand. And then lastly in Dexterity is stealth. Stealth, as it sounds, is how well you can sneak around, how well you can stay concealed, get past an enemy. That is going to be stealth. A little note here that stealth does have that asterisk, should have that on your character sheet. What that is related to your armor. Certain armor, I think a couple in the medium armor, and then a lot of the heavy armor does cause disadvantage with your stealth check because of the bulk of and the nature of the heavy armor. So just be aware of that if you're going to utilize those types of armor, that you might have a disadvantage with your stealth checks. So that can always be a factor. Other aspects of Dexterity is ranged attacks and damage. Anytime you're using a blaster, long-range weapon, Dexterity is going to be your ability modifier that you use for your attack roll and damage roll for that. Armor class, Dexterity is generally used to calculate your armor class, either using all or some of that modifier, and that'll be all based in the armor you pick and figuring out those rules for armor. And lastly, initiative. Dexterity, your Dexterity modifier basically is your initiative modifier. There are other things you can add to that, but that's your base initiative modifier that for when you roll to see combat order. Next up, for the abilities, we have Constitution. Constitution saves. These are generally going to be things like, as I mentioned, poison, trying to resist poison. Holding your breath could be a save. Holding your breath could actually be both a check or a save, depending on the situation. If you're saying, I'm diving into this water, I want to make it through, underneath, you're in a tunnel and you have to swim to the other side, something like that. You're actively doing that, so that would probably be a check. But if you are, in a tunnel and it floods with water, maybe that's a save where you're reacting to the situation. So could be, holding breath is an example of where it could be both ways. So there are no skills with Constitution. So it's just on its own. I don't have the bullet point here, but one thing that does go along with Constitution is hit points. So when you're calculating your hit points, you do add your Constitution ability modifier to your hit points. And that's something we'll go over, I'm sure, another time, but that is one way that Constitution influences another aspect of your character. Oh, there's my bullet point. All right, over to intelligence. Intelligence saving throws. There is one power that I saw within the game that utilizes an intelligence saving throw, and that is the tech power called Shutdown. What that says is you can attempt to shut down some type of technology, and if it's being controlled by someone, that person can make an intelligence saving throw to see if they can resist that. So that was the only use of that. Intelligence saving throws aren't something that come up too often, but that one is there. Skills for intelligence. We have 5 skills here: investigation, lore, nature, piloting, and technology. Most of these are pretty self-explanatory. Investigation is actively looking into whether that's a room or investigating a weapon or things like that. Lore is going to be your history type skill checks. Nature, as that says, looking at whether that's knowing the terrain, knowing animals, something like that. Piloting, pretty obvious and pretty prevalent in Star Wars, how well you can fly a starship. And lastly, definitely a big one in Star Wars is technology, your knowledge and abilities with droids, computers, anything like that. Lastly, with intelligence is that intelligence is the tech casting ability. So just like dexterity was for ranged attacks and damage, strength was for melee, there are abilities that go with your power casting. And for tech casting, you use intelligence. Our next ability is wisdom. For the wisdom saving throws, this one you'll see often with things that relate to being charmed, mind effects. A lot of force powers might use a wisdom saving throw. So that's where that would come into play. Our skills under wisdom, we have animal handling. How well, as it says, you can handle any beast or creature. Insight is how well your character can get a read on another person, see how well you can understand their intentions, if they're being truthful or not. It's generally what you use insight for. Medicine, pretty self-explanatory, helps you understand maybe what type of wound a person has, what the wound has come from, how a person died, things like that. Perception is how well you pick up on things in your surroundings. And then lastly, survival would be hunting, tracking, things like that when you're out in the wild, surviving terrain for that. And wisdom, similar to intelligence, but on the force casting side of things, wisdom is a force casting ability. It is used for universal powers and light side powers specifically. So if you're casting light side powers, you're going to use your wisdom ability modifier if it applies, if the power calls for that. And lastly, in the abilities, we have charisma. Charisma saving throws, we have, I believe there's only one power related to that called group hologram, where you basically turn a group of people into a different image, basically a disguise. If someone is unwilling, they can make a charisma save to not have that effect happen. So I believe that's the only charisma save that's in any powers. Not sure of any other use of that necessarily. For the skills in charisma, we have 4 of them: deception, intimidation, performance, and persuasion. Pretty self-explanatory of what these are. If you're trying to deceive someone, tell a lie, you're going to use deception. If you want to try and get somebody to do something for you and you're being forceful, intimidation. Perhaps you're performing music or putting on you're acting or something like that. You could potentially use performance for a disguise kit skill check. And lastly, persuasion, how well you can get somebody to do something for you, in more of a positive way than intimidation, persuasion there. So, and lastly, charisma, like wisdom, is the other force casting ability. This one relating to the dark side powers. So both wisdom and charisma can be used for universal, but charisma is specific to dark side powers, whereas wisdom was specific to light side. So now that we've covered all of that, let's go one step further and look at our ability modifier. So in the first video, we put together what our ability scores were. So we had initial score, and then that translates into a modifier, and you'll use the modifier to figure out all sorts of things. When you're making those ability checks, you use the ability modifier. The score generally doesn't get used other than just determining what the modifier is. There is a formula for this, and that is your ability score minus 10 divided by 2 rounded down. So I'll show you an example of how we figure this out. So let's say you have an ability score of 17. We're going to subtract 10 from that, and that's going to give us 7. Divide that by 2, and that's going to equal 3.5. Round it down, and our ability mod for this ability is plus 3. So say we threw that into 17 into our dexterity. Our dexterity ability modifier is plus 3. So anything related to dexterity, we add the plus 3. To have a quick example here, if you're in the for a negative modifier, which could happen. So we have a 7 for our initial ability score. Subtract that from 10, and we'll have negative 3. Minus 3 divided by 2 equals minus 1.5, negative 1.5. And rounding down, because you're going to keep going further in the negative, ends up being minus 2. So that would be your ability modifier for that ability with that score of 7. One step further, hopefully not too far in the weeds here, but something that relates, especially in the example we're going to have coming up next here, is your proficiency bonus. So proficiency bonus is a number that reflects the experience in a specific ability or skill, character's experience in that. Now, every class has their class table that shows level by level what they get out of that, and proficiency bonus is one of those things. There is a formula for this, but it might be easier just to reference that table. But if you wanted to know, it is 1 plus 0.25 times your level rounded up. So if you are a level 4 character, 1/4 of that is going to be a 1. So 1 plus 1 equals 2. Your proficiency bonus is going to be 2. And another example, try and do the math off the top of my head here. If we look at, go with level 2, so 1/4 of 2 is 0.5. So you're going to be 1 plus 0.5, so 1.5 rounded up plus 2. So again, levels 1 through 4, you get a plus 2. I believe the next 4 levels, you're at plus 3, etc. Easiest way is just to reference that class table, but formula is there if you want to use it. So we're going to show now how the proficiency bonus comes into play with these other abilities. So I have here a section, an image of a ability score section on your character sheet. Generally, and this is a preference that you might have, but I put the ability score in the smaller area on the smaller box, and then I use my modifier for the big box because I'm going to use that modifier for everything. So we're saying this is a level 1 character. We have a plus 2 proficiency bonus, and with the scores that you can see, strength through intelligence, I've got a 10 in my strength, giving us a 0 modifier, plus 2 dexterity from my 15, plus 1 constitution for 12, and a score of 14 down in intelligence gives me that plus 2. as well as similar to the dexterity. So I've filled in the strength and intelligence scores because I with just 0. Now the reason I'm doing that is related to proficiency. Your class, sometimes your species, sometimes your background, there's different aspects in the game that are going to give you proficiency in a skill or other aspect of the game. So this character, this example character, they are proficient in the dexterity saving throw and the constitution saving throw, as well as these 2 skills, sleight of hand and stealth. So what this means is I get to add in my proficiency bonus with my ability modifier for that specific check. So if we start filling these in here, my saving throw on dexterity actually is a +4. 2 + 2 is our 4. So anytime I need to make a dexterity saving throw, I get to add +4 rather than just +2. Acrobatics, I'm not proficient, so I only get the +2 there. Sleight of hand, +4, because I'm proficient. And stealth, +4, also proficient. And then constitution, +3. 2 + 1 is 3 for the saving throw there because I'm proficient. As I said, proficiency comes from classes. You might have a proficiency from a species or feat or some other feature is going to give that. There are these diamonds on this you see next to some of the circles, and something we might touch on later, but you can gain expertise in a skill. So an expertise means you get to add your proficiency bonus twice. So for example, we were proficient in sleight of hand. It could fill in that diamond just to note it on our character sheet, and we add our proficiency bonus one more time. So that sleight of hand would be a +6. So anytime I roll a sleight of hand check, I'm going to roll that d20 and add +6 to that score, to that check. So it's a nice way to build out a character that can really excel in one area over the other. So that, in a nutshell, is ability scores and the skills, and hopefully a little bit about how the proficiency bonus and the ability modifiers come into play. As I said, we will go into a lot of the other areas, armor class and other things like that. We'll try and get touch on those a little more specifically down the road. But for now, hopefully this rounds out what the abilities and skills are specifically and help you with the next step of building that character. Thank you, as always, to everyone who has followed us, subscribed to us, watched our videos, listened to our podcast, things like that. Check us out, dungeonjedimasters.com, where you can access all of our content, podcast, YouTube, Twitter, Twitch channels, and if you'd like to support us, our Patreon, where we do have exclusive content for those Patreons. Love everyone to check that out. Thanks again. Till next time, may the Force be with you.